Hello and welcome to FP Live. I'm Ravi Agrawal, Foreign Policy's Editor-in-Chief. All eyes are on Alaska tomorrow, where Trump and Putin meet face to face to discuss the future of the war in Ukraine. But here's a prediction. The focus will quickly shift to Ukraine, of course, but also Europe. After all, Brussels will be crucial for any security guarantees. But do European countries have the capacity? They're certainly working on it. In 2024 alone, 10 different European countries increased their defense budgets by at least 20%. The question, however, is how that money gets used and how it plays into the continent's broader growth strategy. If this is your first time joining us on FP Live, welcome. We'll take some subscriber questions. As always, if you would like to join in, use the code FP Live for a discount. We're also a podcast. Just look for FP Live on your favorite audio platform. So I have a data point for you. Back in 2008, the Eurozone and the American economy were roughly the same size. By 2024, the American economy had pulled way ahead. It was nearly double the size of the Eurozone. It's no secret that Europe has struggled with growth. It's also fragmented and very reliant on America. When I was at the NATO summit at The Hague earlier this summer, and countries were promising to increase their defense spending to 5% of their GDPs, I thought to myself, wow, this could go any number of ways, from really worrying to impressive. Well, as it happens, a group of people have been doing some important research and thinking on this very issue. And the person running that group is my guest today. Jared Cohen is the president of global affairs at Goldman Sachs and co-head of the Goldman Sachs Global Institute. This is the third episode of our partner series with the Institute. Jared, it's great to have you back.
Thank you, Ravi.
This really couldn't be more timely. So let's set the stage a little bit. Europe's gone from decades of defense complacency to this shock realization that it needs to rearm. Just give us a quick overview. How are you thinking about the state of Europe's military industry?
So, if you look right now at European defense, there's an important question to ask, which is why are we talking about this now? You mentioned some stats already, which if you look at the last 16 years, 16 years ago, you mentioned correctly that both the European economy and the U.S. economy were roughly about 14.2 trillion. U.S. economy in the last 16 years has grown 87%. Europe's economy has grown 13.5%. So Europe is kind of stuck at 15 trillion. The US is now pretty close to 27 trillion. So something's off there. And I think we kind of ignored this for a while. And if you look at the US defense commitment to Europe, it's kind of let Europe off the hook during those 16 years from having to shoulder defense burden. You see that with 40 US bases and 80,000 troops from the US spread throughout the European continent. But the issue is when Russia invaded Ukraine to kick off, the latest phase of this war, and I say the latest phase of this war because 10 years ago they also invaded and took the Donbass and Crimea, and before that, the decade prior to that, they'd taken Georgia. So none of this should have been a surprise. The scale of what Russia was willing to do in Europe, I think, came as a surprise, and everyone thought post-Cold War that there were limits to what territorial annexation would look like, which is why I think the challenge was largely appeased. But when it was clear that Russia was committed to taking all of Ukraine, the Europeans looked at their own defense industrial sectors and realized that two things were true. One, they had grossly underinvested in it. Two, it became clear that they couldn't count on the US for the security guarantees that they'd come to take for granted. And so that kind of brings us to the inflection point we're at today, which is there's two trends at play. One is an economic trend where it's very clear if you don't grow economically, you start to evaporate geopolitically. And this is not something created by Donald Trump. I think what Donald Trump has done as president is accelerated the realization that Europe has been evaporating from the geopolitical scene. But I like to remind people that the Biden administration was also very tough on Europe, whether it was the IRA or the AUKUS deal that led France to lose a lot of submarine deals and end up temporarily recalling its ambassador from the US. So there's a bipartisan move away from Europe due to its lack of economic growth. The second
Mm.
trend that I think we'll unpack throughout the course of this episode is there's lots of numbers around European defense. And the numbers sound good, as you mentioned, right? So, in the last 4 years, the European member states of NATO have each spent, roughly, 3.9% more on defense annually during that time period. If you look at NATO countries that are spending 2% of their GDP on defense, back in 2014, there was only 3 of them. Last year, 23 of them. Mark
Mhm.
Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, has said by the end of this year, all NATO members will cross the 2% threshold. Although I'm skeptical that Spain, who's stuck around 1.24%, will actually do that. And as you mentioned at the top, at the NATO summit in Hague, they committed to 5% of GDP being spent on defense, by 2035. Now, the carve out to that is 1.5% of it can be spent on infrastructure and logistics, which Prime Minister Meloni in Italy reminded us a couple of days ago with the plans to
Right.
build a bridge to Sicily. And these numbers all sound very compelling, right? But there's 2 questions that I think we have to ponder and wrestle with. One, what does it mean to spend money on defense? Is it all salaries? Is it a way to just kind of subsidize auto industries? Is it a way to build bridges to disconnected parts of your territory, or is it really solving some
Mm.
of the key headwinds that we're going to get into? And then
Yeah.
2, whether it's economic or military, Europe has always been clear. I don't think Europe's problem is one of substance. I think it's one of form. Europe knows exactly what Europe needs to do to grow economically and consolidate its defense push into European champions. It can't do it. I just think
Yeah.
there's too many implementation headwinds, which we can get into. That means that, yes, we'll have wonderful numbers. We'll have a lot of rhetoric around Europe becoming more committed to European defense. And I think all the evidence suggests that it's still going to largely happen at the national level. And there's only so much scale that all these European countries can do at the national level.
Yeah. So you've set the stage really well. I think it's worth now just dividing up our convo into headwinds and tailwinds for Europe as it sets out on this journey to dramatically increase defense spending. So let's start with the pessimist's case. There are all these problems with Europe's economy. Um, what is your sense of how they're able to raise the money and then do so in a way that is not just torn apart by fragmentation? I mean, you mentioned Spain, for example, which has a threat perception that is to the south, not to the east.
Yep.
So the immediate problem is, where does the money come from?
Yeah, look, this is, and I think it's worth, before even getting into that, unpacking some of the headwinds around the economic growth, because I think that's an important piece of context for understanding where the money comes from. So let's start with European fragmentation. If you look at the major defense players in Europe right now, France gets to lead the table because they're the only ones with nuclear weapons.
Mhm.
But if you look at some of the other players, the Italians as an example, they don't want to follow multilateral European architecture that's led by France. Right. And so there's fragmentation around who gets to lead. That's one. Second is it's very hard for these governments to do anything. My favorite question to ask European prime ministers is, what percentage of the vote did you have to win to become prime minister? It's usually like 12 or 13%, right? And so if
Yeah.
they do anything, their coalition collapses, and you end up with a caretaker government. And we see this time and again. It's never been harder to offer up the names of European leaders. They just change so
But
often.
by the way, as an aside, Jared, when at the Hague summit, the government that was putting it together was a caretaker government, which was not
Exactly.
lost on anyone there.
Right. I mean, if you look at Austria and Belgium, they both at the same time were led by caretaker governments
Right.
that were led by former prime ministers
Right.
who neither of who wanted to be there anymore, but had to be there to take the government through. The other big headwind economically is just regulation. I mean, Europe's in a situation where only 4 of the top 50 technology companies are located in Europe. And none of them are going to become European champions because no country wants to give up their national champion for a greater European service. I think you have the other issue, which is, look, it's what you don't have a capital markets union in Europe. So people will flippantly say Europe's an economic union, but not really a robust political union. I actually would be less generous in that. I'd say it's a shared currency. But without a capital markets union that is robust, it's very difficult to see a path towards consolidation. It's very difficult to think about where the money comes from, which is why what you're seeing, in Germany is constitutional changes to, the fiscal debt ceiling to be able to, raise the money for Germany to last year. I think they spent close to 88 billion euros on defense, which made them fourth in the world in terms of defense spending. When you dig into the accounting of that, I'd ask the question, how much of that goes towards entities that also provide spare parts to the auto sector? So again, it gets a little complex, and how much of it goes to salaries.